Diane Kessler never imagined an employee could silence a boardroom just by standing up. 12 executives sat frozen as she looked at Marcus Hale like he was just another name on a payroll spreadsheet. "If you can't handle it, I'll replace you." Marcus didn't argue. He didn't plead. He didn't remind her that 3 of the company's largest clients refused to work with anyone but him. He closed his laptop, set his badge on the table, and walked out without raising his voice. Diane smiled, certain the silence meant she had won. Not long after, the first client called, then a second. By the time the third call reached her desk, she wasn't smiling anymore. Kestrel Dunmore systems always smelled like fresh coffee and quiet dread, and this particular week was no different except for the size of what was writing on it. The company was preparing to launch Project Horizon, a logistics integration contract worth nearly $500 million with a national retail partner called Larkspur Retail Group. On paper, the executive attached to the project was Trevor Lang, a polished strategist who understood boardrooms far better than he understood the systems those boardrooms depended on. In reality, the person who had spent 8 months designing the entire transition plan was Marcus Hale, a quiet, methodical director who rarely raised his voice and never needed to. Marcus had built his reputation the slow way, by being the person leadership called when something broke that nobody else could fix, and by never once demanding credit for doing it. He wore plain shirts, kept an old watch on his wrist, and carried himself like a man who had long ago decided that being right mattered more than being seen. He had joined Kestrel Dunmore 5 years earlier, back when the company was smaller and considerably less obsessed with appearances, and he had watched it grow into something that valued polish over substance more with every passing year. He had turned down 2 better-paying offers during that stretch, both from companies with flashier titles and steeper compensation, because Kestrel Dunmore allowed him a schedule flexible enough to be present for his daughter, a fact that mattered to him more than any number on a signing bonus ever could. His daughter rarely came up in conversation at the office, and he preferred it that way, though anyone who paid close attention noticed the framed drawing propped on his desk and understood without being told exactly why he guarded his evenings so carefully. Colleagues who worked alongside him for any length of time learned quickly that Marcus didn't need to announce his competence, because his competence tended to announce itself the moment something went wrong and he was the one who fixed it before anyone else even understood the problem. He read people well, stayed calm when everyone around him panicked, and had a network of clients and partners who trusted him in a way that had nothing to do with his title and everything to do with years of quietly kept promises. If he had a flaw, it was that he tolerated disrespect longer than he should have, absorbing slights that another man might have challenged immediately, simply because he valued stability enough to let most things go. One morning, Marcus discovered something that made his stomach tighten before he'd even finished his first cup of coffee. The new fulfillment system built for Horizon had failed at stress testing, and if the rollout proceeded on the schedule Diane had already announced to the board, millions of orders could be routed incorrectly within the very first week. He wrote a careful technical memo requesting a short delay, laying out exactly where the failure points sat and what would happen if they weren't addressed. Diane never read past the first paragraph. To her, this wasn't a warning from an engineer who understood the architecture better than anyone in the building. It was a subordinate telling her, days after she'd promised the board a flawless launch, that he couldn't deliver what he'd been assigned. She called an emergency meeting, and when Marcus walked in, she didn't ask him to explain the technical risk. She asked him, in front of the room, whether he was telling her he couldn't get his own system ready. Diane herself had taken the corner office only a few months earlier, arriving with a surname that carried weight across the finance world long before she'd ever set foot in the building. She had grown up believing that importance could be measured, that a person's value to an organization showed up cleanly in the size of the title printed beneath their name, and that anyone who didn't sit at the executive table simply hadn't proven they belonged there yet. Because Marcus carried a director title rather than an executive one, she had quietly filed him away as replaceable the moment she reviewed the organizational chart during her first week, never once questioning whether the chart itself might be wrong. What unsettled her most about him wasn't insubordination, since he never once raised his voice or missed a deadline, but the simple fact that he wasn't afraid of her, and she had started mistaking his composure for defiance long before this particular confrontation ever arrived. Marcus tried to correct the framing, explaining calmly that the system wasn't his alone and that the real issue was leadership cutting the testing window short to hit an arbitrary announcement date. Trevor jumped in before Marcus finished his sentence, saying that everyone in the company was under pressure right now, as though pressure and physics operated by the same rules. Diane ended the exchange with 4 words that would echo through the following weeks. "Then handle it," she said, and moved on to the next agenda item as if the matter were closed. Marcus sat back down, understanding that this had stopped being a conversation about code and servers a long time ago. It had become a demonstration staged for an audience of executives who needed to see that the woman now running Kestrel Dunmore could not be questioned, not even by the one person who actually understood what was breaking underneath the company's feet. Over the following days, the pressure on Marcus multiplied in ways that made no logical sense. Diane wanted the testing finished early. She wanted half the weekend support staff cut to save budget, and she wanted him to simultaneously handle an unrelated crisis for a completely different client. When Marcus pointed out that these 3 demands competed directly for the same limited resources, Diane answered in front of the entire team that good managers find solutions while average managers find excuses. Nobody spoke up in his defense, not because they disagreed with him, but because everyone in that room understood exactly what happened to people who challenged Diane twice in the same week. Trevor, sensing an opportunity rather than a warning, quietly lifted a portion of Marcus's contingency plan and folded it into his own presentation for the board without so much as mentioning where it came from. Trevor had spent his entire career mastering a different skill set than Marcus's, one built almost entirely on knowing which rooms mattered and which people in those rooms needed flattering at any given moment. He could read a boardroom the way Marcus read a broken system, sensing exactly which sentence would land well and which one would cost him standing, and he had climbed steadily by attaching himself to whichever narrative currently held the most favor. He genuinely believed, in the quiet corners of his own mind, that strategy mattered more than execution, that the person who described the plan deserved more credit than the person who kept the plan from collapsing. It rarely occurred to him that the two were the same work wearing different clothes, and it certainly never occurred to him that borrowing someone else's labor without acknowledgement might eventually catch up with him. The board loved it. They praised Trevor for being thorough, for anticipating risk, for demonstrating exactly the kind of foresight they wanted from their new leadership team. Marcus sat at the far end of the table and watched his own work presented back to him by a man who couldn't have explained a single line of the underlying logic if his life depended on it. Diane turned to the room and said, "This is what executive-level thinking looks like." And something in Marcus's chest went very still. It wasn't that she failed to notice his contribution. It was that she had no interest in noticing it, because noticing it would have meant admitting that the person holding the company together wasn't the person she'd built her strategy around. A colleague pulled him aside afterward and gently suggested that he needed to promote himself more. Marcus only said that if the system worked, he didn't need applause, though for the first time in years he found himself wondering whether his own silence had quietly taught people it was acceptable to walk over him. Diane called an evening meeting, and Marcus requested to join remotely since he had a standing family commitment that night that had been on his calendar for weeks. In front of the other executives, Diane made a point of saying that this was a senior-level crisis and that personal scheduling couldn't always come first, letting the remark hang in the air long enough for everyone to absorb its implication. Marcus came in person anyway, rearranged his evening at real cost to himself, and resolved the crisis in under 40 minutes. Instead of a word of thanks, Diane remarked to the room that when people were pushed, they usually discovered they had more capacity than they thought, as though his sacrifice had simply proven her right rather than proven anything about him at all. That was the moment the disrespect stopped being professional and started becoming personal. Diane had quietly begun treating the fact that Marcus was raising a child alone as evidence that he lacked the hunger required for real executive leadership, a belief she never said aloud in front of him but made no effort to hide from Trevor. Marcus happened to overhear part of a conversation between them one afternoon, Diane saying that men who wanted stability rarely took real risks, and that people like Marcus valued a predictable paycheck over ambition. Trevor laughed and answered that this was exactly why Marcus would never leave, a line that would come back to haunt both of them in ways neither could have predicted. They had convinced themselves that a man who needed his job would absorb any amount of disrespect, mistaking his patience for dependency and his composure for weakness. It was, in hindsight, the single worst assumption either of them ever made about another human being, and it would cost the company far more than either of them understood standing in that hallway. Marcus didn't confront either of them about what he'd overheard, and later he would tell himself that silence was simply his nature, though the truth sat a little heavier than that explanation allowed. He drove home that evening, turning the exchange over in his mind, thinking about how easily people who had never once carried the weight he carried could look at his life and mistake caution for a lack of hunger. He didn't feel ashamed of the choices that had shaped his path, of the nights spent reading bedtime stories instead of chasing another title, of the mornings built around a school drop-off rather than an early flight to some conference that promised visibility. What bothered him wasn't Diane's opinion of his ambition, since her opinion had never once been something he needed in order to sleep well at night. What bothered him was the growing suspicion that his own patience had somehow been mistaken by nearly everyone around him for permission. The second stress test for Project Horizon failed even worse than the first, and this time Marcus traced the failure directly to a vendor module that Trevor himself had selected months earlier without consulting operations. If the rollout proceeded as scheduled, the system carried a real chance of collapsing entirely the moment traffic hit its projected peak. Marcus built a precise, unambiguous report laying out exactly what that would cost the company, estimating the potential financial exposure somewhere between $35 million and $60 million within the first 2 days alone if the failure occurred as modeled. Renee Okafor, the company's general counsel, read the report and understood immediately that this was no longer a scheduling disagreement but a genuine liability question that could not simply be waved away by executive confidence. Diane, however, was under enormous pressure of her own, watching the company's stock slide after a rocky quarter, and delaying the first major launch of her tenure felt to her like a public admission that she wasn't in control. Behind closed doors, she had been fielding pointed questions from board members who wanted assurance that the company's newest leader could deliver results without the kind of delay that made investors nervous. She had built her entire pitch to the board around speed and decisiveness, positioning herself as the antidote to what she described as the slow, overly cautious culture of the previous administration. Admitting now that the flagship project of her first year needed more time would have meant admitting that the very qualities she'd sold herself on were the ones now threatening to sink her, and she wasn't prepared to make that admission to anyone, least of all to a director she'd already dismissed as overly cautious. She ordered the rollout to continue exactly as planned, and Marcus refused to sign the technical approval that would have certified the system as ready for launch. "Are you refusing a direct instruction?" Diane asked, her voice sharpening in a way that made even Trevor shift uncomfortably in his seat. "I'm refusing to certify something I know isn't ready," Marcus answered without raising his voice or breaking eye contact, and the calm in his tone somehow made the refusal land harder than shouting ever could have. Diane took this as a direct challenge to her authority rather than what it actually was. A warning from the one person in the building who understood the machinery well enough to see the crash coming before it happened. Trevor offered to simply find another manager willing to sign off in Marcus's place, and Marcus answered quietly that they could find another signature easily enough, but they couldn't change what the system was actually going to do once it was live. Diane scheduled an emergency meeting for the following morning, and something in the atmosphere told everyone in that hallway that the real confrontation had only been postponed, not avoided. 12 people filled the conference room the next morning, including the chief financial officer, 2 vice presidents, Renee, Trevor, and a representative from Larkspur joining remotely from another time zone. Diane didn't open with numbers or projections. She opened with Marcus, telling the room that he had spent 5 years being the guy who explains why things are difficult, a line clearly rehearsed for effect rather than accuracy. Marcus tried once more to steer the conversation back toward the actual data, and Diane cut him off before he'd finished his first sentence, repeating the accusation with more edge in her voice than before. "I've spent 5 years making sure difficult things don't become expensive things," Marcus answered. For a moment, nobody in the room said anything at all. Diane's jaw tightened, and something in her expression suggested she had decided right then that this exchange was no longer about a project timeline but about who actually controlled the room. Then she said the words that would define everything that followed. "If you can't handle it, I'll replace you," she told him flatly, loud enough that everyone at the table understood it was meant as a final public verdict rather than an ordinary managerial threat. The room went completely silent, and Diane seemed to expect Marcus to soften, to ask for more resources, to quietly agree to sign whatever needed signing just to keep his position secure. Instead, Marcus asked a single simple question. "Is that your final position?" He said, and Diane answered without hesitation that it absolutely was. Marcus nodded once, closed his laptop, reached into his jacket, and removed his employee badge, setting it gently on the polished table in front of him. "Then you should replace me," he said, and stood up from his chair with the same unhurried calm he brought to every crisis he'd ever solved for that company. Nobody in that room moved for several seconds, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything spoken aloud during the entire meeting. The representative from Larkspur, watching through the video screen mounted at the far end of the table, glanced between Diane and the empty chair Marcus had just vacated, clearly recalculating something in real time. The chief financial officer shifted in his seat and opened his mouth as though to say something, then thought better of it and closed it again, staring down at the papers in front of him instead. Renee kept her eyes fixed on the badge sitting alone on the polished wood, as though the small piece of plastic had somehow become the most important object in the entire building. Trevor laughed under his breath, assuming Marcus was bluffing, that this was simply a negotiating tactic meant to force a raise or a title change before lunch. Marcus looked past him toward Renee and said quietly and evenly that his resignation would be in writing before he reached the lobby. Then he walked out of the room without slamming a single door or raising his voice even once. There was no dramatic exit, no parting insult, no threat thrown over his shoulder on the way out, and that restraint was exactly what made the moment land so hard for everyone left sitting at that table. Diane told the room with total confidence that he'd reconsider once his anger cooled off and reality set in about how few options a man his age actually had. Renee looked down at the badge still sitting on the table where Marcus had left it and said quietly that she didn't think he would. Nobody in that room understood yet just how right she was. Diane assigned Trevor to take over Project Horizon immediately, and within the hour he was opening files Marcus had left behind, discovering with growing unease just how many moving pieces his former colleague had been quietly managing without anyone noticing. The first phone call came less than 20 minutes after Marcus's badge hit the table, from the chief operating officer at Larkspur, asking directly to speak with Marcus about a routing detail scheduled for that afternoon. Diane told him as gently as she could manage that Marcus was no longer with the company, and the silence that followed on the other end of the line lasted long enough to become uncomfortable. "Then pause the rollout," the executive said, explaining that Larkspur had only agreed to move forward on this timeline because Marcus personally committed to overseeing the transition himself. Diane tried to reassure them that Trevor was fully capable of taking over the account without any disruption to the relationship. The Larkspur executive politely declined the offer and asked to be connected with someone at a higher level before the day was over. A short while later, a second major client called with the same request. Having heard through their own account representative that Marcus had left the building entirely without warning, they asked for a full review of the contract renewal that was still sitting on the table and signed, and made it clear they wanted answers before anyone brought up numbers again. A third call arrived not long after, from a strategic partner who had worked closely with Marcus on integration projects for nearly 3 years, and this time the question was blunt and unavoidable. "Who's replacing Hale?" the caller asked directly, and Diane answered that the company had plenty of qualified people ready to step into the role without missing a beat. "That wasn't my question," the caller replied. For the first time since taking the corner office, Diane understood that Marcus's position on the organizational chart had never once reflected the true size of his influence. By the end of that first day, Diane's assistant had logged 11 separate calls from clients and partners asking about Marcus's departure, a number that kept climbing even after she stopped counting out loud in front of the rest of the leadership team. Some callers were polite and simply wanted reassurance that their accounts remained in capable hands, while others were considerably more direct, demanding to know exactly who would be reviewing the fine details they had always trusted Marcus to catch before anyone else even noticed them. Diane spent the entire afternoon on the phone repeating some version of the same reassurance, telling each caller that the company remained fully capable and that nothing about their partnership needed to change. Few of them sounded convinced, and by evening she had started to understand, in a way she hadn't allowed herself to consider that morning, that the calm confidence in her own voice was doing very little to settle the growing unease on the other end of the line. Trevor spent the rest of the afternoon trying to prove that Marcus could be replaced simply by reassigning his responsibilities across 3 different managers, confident that dividing the workload would make the transition painless. Instead, problems began surfacing almost immediately, each one revealing just how much invisible judgment had been holding the operation together behind the scenes. Nobody could explain why certain vendor terms had been structured the way they were, or which clients needed advance notice before any routing change went live, or which small unofficial exceptions Marcus had quietly maintained through years of personal trust rather than written policy. His documentation, when the new team finally dug into it, turned out to be thorough and complete, which only made this situation more damning rather than less. The problem was never that Marcus had hoarded information to make himself irreplaceable. The problem was that leadership had spent years assuming his work was simple, precisely because he made it look effortless. Renee had joined the legal department nearly a decade earlier and had watched enough executive turnover to recognize the particular kind of trouble now unfolding across the company. She wasn't naturally inclined to take sides in internal disputes, preferring instead to let evidence speak for itself long before she formed a personal opinion about who deserved blame. What struck her most as she reviewed the record wasn't simply the volume of Marcus's contributions, but how consistently he had chosen not to advertise them, filing careful reports and quiet memos instead of pursuing recognition the way most ambitious people in that building typically did. She began to understand that his restraint hadn't been a lack of confidence at all, but a kind of discipline most executives in the company had never bothered to practice. Renee pulled the incident history covering the past year and a half and laid the results out on Diane's desk without a word of explanation attached. In that span, Marcus had personally saved 11 client accounts that were on the verge of leaving the company entirely, and had directly rescued 3 separate projects that were on track to collapse under their own weight. He had built a process that saved the company more than $14 million annually in avoidable operational losses, a figure buried deep in a report that had been presented to the board under someone else's name. Most of what he'd accomplished over those months had quietly been credited to other executives sitting comfortably around that same conference table. Renee didn't argue or editorialize as she placed the folder in front of Diane, and she didn't need to, because the numbers said everything Diane had spent months refusing to hear from Marcus directly. For the first time, Diane began to understand exactly why he had never needed to campaign for recognition inside the building. His clients already knew precisely who he was, even if his own company had chosen not to. That evening, Marcus sat in his kitchen while his daughter finished her homework at the table beside him, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, his work phone stayed completely silent. She asked him, without looking up from her worksheet, why he seemed different tonight, quieter than usual, but somehow less tired, and he told her honestly that he had left his job that day. She asked if that meant something bad had happened, and he thought about the question longer than she probably expected, eventually telling her that sometimes leaving a place is exactly how a person protects the things that matter most to them. She seemed satisfied with the answer in the effortless way children often are, returning to her worksheet without another question, and Marcus sat there for a long moment simply watching her work, grateful in a way words couldn't quite capture that he had somewhere steady to sit while the rest of his professional life rearranged itself somewhere far away. He didn't feel triumphant or vindicated, only lighter. The way a person feels when a weight they'd carried so long they'd forgotten it was there finally slides off their shoulders. His phone rang once, and the name on the screen belonged to Julian Voss, the chief executive of Ashgrove Meridian Logistics, the company's largest and most respected competitor in the region. Julian didn't ask why Marcus had resigned, and he didn't offer sympathy or pretend to be surprised by what had happened. "I heard you're available," he said simply. Marcus asked how the news had traveled so quickly across an industry that size. "People notice," Julian answered, "when the person holding up the building suddenly decides to walk outside and see what the weather's like." Julian Voss had built Ashgrove Meridian Logistics from a modest regional carrier into one of the most respected names in the industry, and he had done it by hiring people who understood systems rather than people who merely understood how to talk about them. He had crossed paths with Marcus on 2 joint projects years earlier, both times walking away impressed by how quickly Marcus diagnosed problems that had stumped teams on both sides for weeks. Unlike Diane, Julian had never confused a person's title with their value, having learned early in his own career that the quietest person in the room was often the one keeping everything else from falling apart. He didn't need a recruiter or a headhunter to tell him what Marcus was worth, because he had already watched him work, and that first-hand knowledge was worth more to him than any resume could ever be. Julian asked to meet the following morning, and when they sat down, he didn't offer Marcus a lateral position or a title meant to sound impressive without carrying real weight behind it. He offered him the role of Vice President of Operations Architecture, complete with genuine authority, his own budget, and full control over building his own team from the ground up. Marcus didn't accept immediately, telling Julian plainly that what he wanted most wasn't a bigger paycheck, but an environment where raising a legitimate warning wasn't mistaken for disloyalty or weakness. "That's exactly why I called you first," Julian said, and something in the directness of the answer told Marcus this offer wasn't built on flattery, but on genuine respect for the work he'd quietly done for years. While that conversation unfolded, Diane was calling his personal number over and over, each unanswered ring adding another layer of pressure onto a week that was already collapsing around her. Marcus looked at the screen, saw her name, and let it ring through without a trace of anger behind the decision, because as far as he was concerned, that chapter of his life had already closed. Project Horizon was suspended within days, and the board demanded a full explanation for how a nearly $500 million launch had unraveled so quickly and so publicly. Diane initially tried to frame the disaster around Marcus's sudden departure during a critical stretch of the project, hoping the narrative would shift blame away from her own decisions. Renee calmly produced the emails and meeting notes documenting exactly how many weeks Marcus had spent warning leadership about the very failure that had just occurred in front of a national client. Worse for Diane, an internal recording captured the exact moment she told him in front of a full room that she would replace him if he couldn't handle the workload. One board member asked plainly whether Marcus had actually failed to handle anything, and nobody in the room offered an answer. Another asked whether he had instead simply refused to approve something he knew with certainty was unsafe to launch, and the silence that followed said more than any explanation could have. The board hired an outside firm to conduct the audit, unwilling to trust an internal review that might quietly protect the very people responsible for the failure in the first place. Investigators spent nearly 2 weeks combing through email threads, meeting recordings, and file histories, slowly reconstructing a timeline that painted a very different picture than the one Diane had originally presented. They found memo after memo from Marcus dated weeks and sometimes months before each crisis, each one containing the exact warning that leadership had chosen to dismiss or bury under a more convenient version of events. They found presentation files where Trevor's name appeared as the sole author on documents whose file properties showed they had actually been created entirely on Marcus's computer. Trevor tried to defend his own role in the collapse, but a full internal audit revealed that he had repeatedly taken credit for reports and strategies that had originated entirely from Marcus's work over the previous year. The board demanded his resignation within the week, ending a career he had built almost entirely on borrowed competence rather than genuine expertise. Diane wasn't removed outright, but her operational authority was sharply curtailed, and she was placed under direct oversight from a newly formed board committee for the following 6 months. In a private meeting near the end of that difficult stretch, Renee told her plainly that she had spent months asking whether Marcus could be replaced. "You never once asked," Renee said, "what would happen if he decided to replace all of us instead?" Diane had no answer prepared for that particular truth. Diane finally called Marcus directly, and when he answered, she didn't apologize or acknowledge what she had said to him in front of that entire room. Instead, she told him the company was prepared to discuss an adjustment, choosing the word carefully, as though precision could substitute for honesty. "An adjustment to what?" Marcus asked, and she answered with a short list that included his title, his compensation, and the scope of his responsibilities, none of which touched the real issue between them. "What about respect?" Marcus asked simply, and the long pause that followed told him everything he needed to know about whether she had actually learned anything from the past 2 weeks. He declined the offer politely, without bitterness, and hung up, understanding that some things couldn't be fixed with a bigger number attached to a job title. 2 weeks later, Kestrel Dunmore called an urgent meeting with Larkspur in a last attempt to salvage what remained of the relationship before the contract collapsed entirely. Diane walked into the room to find the Larkspur Chief Operating Officer, their Chief Financial Officer, and a full team of technical advisors already seated and waiting. Then the door opened again, and Marcus walked in not as a former employee returning to explain himself, but standing beside Julian Voss as an equal partner in the conversation. Diane felt the air leave the room, because Ashgrove Meridian had just been invited by Larkspur to bid on an alternative solution if Kestrel Dunmore couldn't prove it was capable of delivering what it had promised. "You already know our new Vice President of Operations Architecture," Julian said simply, and nobody in the room needed his name repeated for the introduction to land with full weight. Marcus sat down directly across from Diane without a trace of satisfaction on his face, because he hadn't come there to enjoy her discomfort, only to do the job in front of him with the same professionalism he'd always brought to the work. The conference room at Larkspur's headquarters felt colder than Diane remembered from previous visits, or maybe it only felt that way with Marcus sitting calmly on the opposite side of the table instead of somewhere beside her the way he once had. She noticed small details she had never paid attention to before, the way he set his materials down without fumbling, the way he waited for a question to finish completely before answering it, the way his voice carried authority without ever needing volume to prove it. It struck her uncomfortably that she was seeing him clearly for the first time, not because he had changed in any meaningful way, but because she had finally stopped filtering him through the assumptions she'd carried into that first stress test disagreement weeks earlier. When Larkspur asked for his honest assessment of Project Horizon, Marcus didn't attack his former employer or exaggerate the damage to make Ashgrove Meridian look better by comparison. He answered with complete objectivity, explaining that the system could still be salvaged, but that it would realistically require 3 additional weeks and a genuine commitment to the risk controls that leadership had previously chosen to ignore. That composure cut deeper than any insult could have, because the man Diane once described as unable to handle pressure was now the only person in the room capable of calmly explaining how to save the very project she'd staked her reputation on. Watching him speak with such measured clarity, several people in the room seemed to quietly recalculate everything they thought they understood about who had actually been holding that company together for the past several years. The internal audit at Kestrel Dunmore eventually confirmed everything Renee had already suspected about the true source of the company's recent successes. Trevor had concealed unfavorable stress test results, presented work that Marcus had built as his own original strategy, and repeatedly encouraged Diane to dismiss technical warnings that would have prevented most of the damage entirely. The board accepted his resignation without hesitation, closing out a career built almost entirely on claiming credit that belonged to someone quieter and far more competent than he had ever managed to appear. Diane wasn't dismissed outright, but her decision-making authority was placed under close supervision, and she spent the following months reporting directly to a committee formed specifically to prevent another crisis like the one she had created. In one of the final meetings addressing the fallout, Renee reminded her once more that she had spent so much energy asking whether one man could be replaced that she never considered the far more dangerous question standing right in front of her the entire time. A few months later, Marcus had settled fully into his new role at Ashgrove Meridian. Nothing about his life had transformed into some dramatic fantasy of overnight wealth or sweeping personal revenge. What changed was simpler and, in its own way, far more meaningful than any of that. He finally held authority that matched the responsibility he'd always quietly carried, along with a team of his own, fair compensation, and a schedule that respected the fact that he was raising a child on his own without apology. His new chief executive consulted him before making major decisions in his area of expertise instead of treating his caution as an inconvenience to be managed around. Project Horizon eventually launched at Kestrel Dunmore 3 weeks later than originally scheduled, almost exactly the delay Marcus had requested from the very beginning of the entire ordeal. Word traveled quickly through the industry about what had happened at Kestrel Dunmore, not because anyone leaked confidential details, but because clients and partners talked to one another far more than most executives ever realize. People who had worked alongside Marcus over the years weren't surprised by any of it, though several admitted privately that they were surprised it had taken this long for the rest of the company to recognize what they had known all along. His new colleagues at Ashgrove Meridian quickly learned the same lesson everyone at his old company had learned the hard way. That his calm exterior wasn't a sign of low stakes, but a sign of a man who had simply stopped needing to perform urgency in order to feel competent. Kestrel Dunmore ultimately lost a meaningful share of its business to Ashgrove Meridian, though not because Marcus ever tried to pull clients away out of spite or personal ambition. Their own clients made that choice independently, deciding on their own that they wanted to work with the team they had genuinely come to trust over years of steady, reliable service. One afternoon, a short email arrived in Marcus's inbox from Diane, containing only a single line, "I should have listened." He read it once, sat with it for a moment without any need to respond right away, and then closed the message and returned to the meeting already waiting for him on his calendar. Diane had once believed that power meant being able to tell another person they were replaceable whenever it suited her. Marcus taught her, without ever raising his voice or seeking revenge, that real power sometimes belongs to the person who respects themselves enough to close the laptop, set down the badge, and simply walk out of the room. Late that same evening, Marcus sat on the porch after his daughter had gone to sleep, thinking not about Diane, or the boardroom, or the badge he had left behind on that polished table, but about the years leading up to that moment. He thought about every quiet report he had filed, every crisis he had solved without asking for recognition, every evening he had chosen his daughter over some meeting that felt urgent only because someone else had decided it should be. None of that patience had been wasted, he realized, even in the years when it seemed to earn him nothing but more work and less acknowledgement, because it had shaped him into exactly the kind of steady, trustworthy presence that a company like Ashgrove Meridian recognized the moment they saw it. Loyalty, he understood now, was never supposed to mean tolerating disrespect indefinitely in exchange for a paycheck, and self-respect was never something a title could grant or take away. He finished his coffee, looked out at the quiet street in front of his house, and allowed himself, finally, to simply feel proud of the choice he had made.